So thank you so much for having me here, for bringing me over, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to try to do this slightly looser. The Dutch poet Menno Wickman says that the sun, the beauty of the sun, would never have occurred to him if it didn't set every night. And I'm sure that the beauty of our civilization wouldn't have been so clear in all of our hearts if we didn't feel that it was setting in some way, that it's in decline, that it's under threat. In so many ways, in every field of life, in aesthetics, for example, in architecture. If you look at the ancient European cities, if you go to the old center of Paris or of Amsterdam, and you travel outward to the outskirts, and we've already talked about the ghettoization that's happening there because of immigration. That's one part of decline, but merely the buildings that we're capable of building today, compared with the things we used to build in ages when we didn't have a fraction of the technologies that we have today. It's very, very remarkable, the dazzling decline that we're witnessing amongst us. The decline in manners, in music, the quality of the music that we're producing today is just absolutely nothing compared to Schumann and Beethoven and the great composers of our past. And also economically. I was talking about this with my Dutch friend. I'm here with Rolf Dekker, who's sitting here, who is involved with the academic institution of our party. I'll tell a little bit more about his work later in my speech. But we were talking about the generation of his parents and also the generation of my grandparents. With one teacher, the man being a teacher, being able to provide for 4 children, live in a proper, decent house in a nice neighborhood, have a car, have 1 or 2 holidays every year. This was a very well possible way of living in Europe, and I'm sure in the US as well, up until the 1980s. And what has happened to us now? That it's impossible, even for both parents having a full-time job, simply to buy a house in the Netherlands now, simply to sustain a two-children family household. And we've talked about declining birth rates, of course, but the economic aspect of this decline I think is rarely studied, because we continue to praise ourselves that we have mobile phones now and we have, whatever, the internet and other gadgets that make us feel like there's an increase in our welfare and our economic capabilities. But I'm not sure that's actually true, that actually holds true. If you look over a period of several decades, I think the average household has experienced a very steep, a very significant, and very worrying decline. So this decline, which is so omnipresent, was the first thing really that I realized when I started thinking about the world. I grew up in a very protected environment, playing the piano mostly, preparing for what would be hopefully a life of beauty and art. And as I started to go to college, I was 18 years old, the very first day of my college life was September 11th, 2001. Quite a start. And gradually, as I started thinking more about what was going on in the world, I had the experience that one of the people that I started reading at that time, Roger Scruton, describes in his autobiography, Gentle Regrets. He is in Paris in May 1968, and he's studying philosophy. And he's sitting in his small student room looking out over the boulevards where the students are rioting and bullying police officers. And he says, he writes in this beautiful book, he says, whatever they'd believe, I decided I would believe the opposite. And that's how, during my 20s, I gradually became more involved in politics and more of an activist, called to the front, as it were, to defend the things that were so omnipresent and so self-evident in my childhood. And I decided that more arguments should be written, so I published a number of books in Dutch. Unfortunately, only one has been translated. I'd love to talk more about it over lunch with you. But to write and to try to organize people around the right causes. And then I set up a movement, Forum for Democracy, which started off in 2014 as a think tank, an American-style think tank organizing meetings such as these. And then in September 2016, I turned it into a political party, got elected into parliament in March 2017, and at the next general elections, which were in March 2019, so half a year ago, those were elections for the Senate, not for parliament, but we turned out the largest party in the country. And so we had a magnificent success. We experienced an incredible electoral victory, and also a very interesting mechanism, which is something that the gentlemen before me have talked about, which is the ways in which the established powers then reconvene to defend themselves. All kinds of insults get thrown at you. All kinds of fascinating personal remarks that all of a sudden seem to matter everything to you. That once, 5 years ago, you were at a conference where somebody else was also present, who had then said 20 years before that it's really very, very remarkable how these. It's not just guilt by association. It's guilt by association, by association, by association. It's an eternal chain of associations that sort of grab, and ultimately you're responsible, obviously, for the murder of Julius Caesar, which is really what I think we should. Anyway, it was beautiful. It was remarkable to experience such success and to feel that the Dutch came their way, as it were. So we set up this movement, and then all of a sudden the electorate showed up and said, yes, let's do this together. Let's bring out a message to the established institutions. And I think as a political party, obviously, we don't always talk about the underlying cultural issues. We don't really talk about architecture and the arts and the loss of chivalrous manners and the tragic loss of the way in which courtship is performed these days. All of those things that really actually matter to us about civilization, but we express it in political terms. And the three main messages that we talk about in our party and in our conferences and in parliament are mass immigration, obviously, multiculturalism, the way in which our identities are being diluted through continuous flows of immigration, and even when people that have been offered asylum in the Netherlands, such as the Syrians, for example, could easily be helped to go back to their countries. Government is unwilling to do anything about it and prefers to give them a permanent residence so they can bring over their families, so they can become Dutch citizens ad infinitum. It's so obvious that there is an agenda of derootment, there's an agenda of delusion of national identities, which is strengthened, reinforced by the European Union, which is the second main point of our agenda. We talk about supranationalism and the way in which all these supranational institutions, in the US obviously you haven't got an issue with the EU, but you do have the International Criminal Court that is lurking over your shoulders. You have the international human rights obsession that tries to break into national jurisdictions and override national decision-making, national democracies. So this is a very important second main message that we bring. And the third one has also been mentioned already, is the heresy of the climate clerics. I think quite rightly, my friend Michel complained that nobody knows the stories of the religious stories of the Bible anymore. But there's one story that seems to have returned to us, which is the story of the Ark of Noah, isn't it? Rising floods because of our sins. We have to repent because otherwise the seas will come and take us. And that is, and they even use child soldiers, right? Child soldiers. We have the geeky Greta, who is put on stages, and we're not allowed to attack her, obviously, because she's merely a child. But then everybody has to listen to her at the same time. I think it's one of the proofs of Donald Trump's utter geniusness is his tweet about her. Did you see it? I see a very happy child. And then 5 expression mark. I think that was absolutely spot on. That was great. It was just brilliant. Anyway, so I think those are the 3 main political agendas of our opponents: mass immigration, supranationalism, and the climate hysteria. And all those 3 movements stem from a single vision of the future, which is one where the bourgeois state, the bourgeois society no longer exists, where we will be uprooted, where we will no longer be any identifiable nation or any identifiable family even, but we will be individuals completely disconnected from every historical tie, every horizontal social tie. And the mass immigration obviously is bringing this about by making it impossible even to talk about national identity anymore. Universities in the Netherlands no longer teach in Dutch. It is now the master's degrees in the Netherlands are no longer taught in Dutch. It is a stated vision of our current government that all of our higher educated people should be thinking firstly in and expressing themselves in the international language, which, as much as I love being with British and American friends and love speaking English, I think is a tremendous loss, and it's a terrible tragedy. But also because of the European Union and other steps towards global government, weakening every ability we might have to have functioning democracies. And then thirdly, let's say the final blow of their agenda, the climate thing, which makes it necessary for all of us to accept a quasi-socialist world government that can decide what kind of meat, or even if we're allowed to eat meat anymore, what kind of vegetation, what kind of agriculture, what kind of social policies. It really is the excuse for them through their supranational institutions, and after mass migration has significantly loosened our national identities and thus our means to resist such global interference, really to push through with their agenda and take over our lives up until the tiniest detail, because it might affect the climate. Which, of course, scientifically, academically, it's bogus, it's completely bogus, the whole point of it. But even if one were to say, look, we need to do something about the way we are extracting energies or the way it should be decided at a national level, and we should never accept the global elements in this. So I think if we move one level deeper then, if this is the vision of our opponents, what does it really come from? And my view is that the philosopher Theodor Adorno, who was already mentioned before, also didn't write just the book with Horkheimer, together with Horkheimer, The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, but also another book which is perhaps just as important, the twin book to that book, as it were, which is called The Authoritarian Personality. And I don't think the current mainstream in politics, in culture, in architecture, because mind you, the people that are living in this post-historical world are the kind of people that are celebrated in modern architecture, modern nowhere architecture, the international style, that you can't distinguish the outskirts of Amsterdam with Pyongyang anymore. It's the same, you know, there's no way to distinguish, you know, where am I? Am I in Amsterdam or am I in Pyongyang? It's the same thing. It's a nowhere world that we're creating through modern architecture, and all are part of the same philosophy, I think, which is the philosophy of creating an anti-authoritarian personality, non-authoritarian personality, which was celebrated by Adorno and Horkheimer and other philosophers of the Frankfurt School. And they presented the argument for that new personality in the other book about the dialectic of the Enlightenment, obviously. But they've really set out their vision of a post-identity humanity. I think in our general list of Frankfurt School philosophers, there's one guy missing, and his name is John Lennon, because he also wrote an important book in that, which is called "Imagine There's No Countries and No Religion Too." This is precisely the vision that they have of what the future should look like, and it's extraordinary how successful this is and how omnipresent it is. How much, to what extent we see it everywhere. We see it in, as I mentioned, in politics, in architecture, in academics, in journalism, in the scientific journals with the climate mystique. And that has brought me to the conclusion that Antonio Gramsci was a far greater revolutionary than Lenin. I think the great Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, when he was writing about power in the 1920s in Italy, he said that we shouldn't, got it, 5 minutes, we shouldn't be merely taking over power such as the Leninists had done in Russia, because power can be toppled, revolutions can be orchestrated, governments can change. But we need to get, we being Antonio Gramsci and his communist friends, we need to get into the institutions of society. And then he used an incredible metaphor, which I think is beautiful. He said, the electorate and power comes and goes like the tides of the sea. You have high tide and low tide, and these are somewhat like the poles we experience with our several political movements. I've been extremely fortunate of winning in such a small period of time the largest number of votes in the Netherlands. But I'm very aware that, you know, the next elections, the electorate might not support us to the extent that they have. Or we might win another one. That would be wonderful, of course. But then ultimately, it will always go up and down. But we need to get to the undertide, the stream under the tides of the sea, the deep stream, where actually power can be institutionalized in a much more stable manner. And that's why I think it's so important what we're doing here, because we are creating not just a political narrative and political alliances, but cultural and societal alliances. We need to become friends. We need to do this much more often. I think it's wonderful to be here. And through that way, gradually build our networks in academics, in journalistic magazines, on the internet obviously, but also on paper, in the arts. We need to get architectural prizes, we need to get publishing houses, so our books are being translated, and we get to know each other's authors and thinkers. And so this is what explains, I think, the success of the left. it's not just that they win elections, it's that they have the media on their side, they have the universities on their sides, they have the civil service on their sides. They've built this for decades before they actually brought the political successes to the front. They have been doing this since the 1950s and 1960s, even before that. 1920s even. They started already slowly expelling conservative voices from universities. I'm sure you have this in the US as well. In the Netherlands, it's almost impossible to be a conservative academic. It's just, they're so intolerant. The left is so intolerant. It's extraordinary how intolerant they are. You're not just wrong, you're a bad person when you disagree with them. And we, being used to listening to arguments, we are always willing to argue, which is great. I think we should keep that. But we should realize that our opponents are, most of the time, not interested in arguments. Because they're going to lose them. They know it somewhere. Anyway, I think that's what we should do as well. We should prepare for not just political, but societal organization. We should build networks. We should become friends. And you know, when the sun's setting, at some point you realize it will rise again. I hope it will. I'm not sure it always will. I'm sure that nostalgia is also one of our greatest, the things that distinguish us from almost every other civilization, that the West has sort of incorporated the sense of loss and has accepted that things are sometimes lost forever, but also with the resurrection being the central thought of the Christian religion, has always kept the feeling that something that has been thought to be lost forever can reawaken. And the final thought maybe is that one of such reawakenings was obviously the Italian Renaissance. And the Italian Renaissance started in Italy, but in the city-states of Italy. And there might be a reason for that, which is that perhaps to some extent small governing units, or small units in general, can nurture innovative change much better than large units. This is perhaps one of the extraordinary explanations for Europe's success, that we have never really been brought under centralized rule, other than, for example, Russia or China. And precisely the competition between our several nations brought such innovative force to us. Well, that existed to an incredible extent in northern Italy around the time of the Renaissance. And then, allow me to be slightly patriotic, if you look at Europe today, which country compares mostly to the Italian city-states of the Renaissance? It's our small Netherlands. And I hope that the Netherlands will be one of the countries in the forefront of this movement of renaissance, of reawakening, of resurrection of our sense of pride, our sense of culture, our sense of togetherness. And I thank you so much for having me. I thank you for listening to me. And I hope to meet all of you in person today. Thank you.